At the age of 30, Richard Dreyfuss reached a peak that most actors could only dream of when he won the Oscar for Best Actor for his role in The Goodbye Girl, becoming one of the youngest in film history to achieve this honor. Before that, he had made a strong impression with his role in American Graffiti, the film that brought him national attention, and just a few years later, he appeared in Jaws, the blockbuster that launched Hollywood's blockbuster era, bringing in huge box office revenue and spreading his name worldwide. Following that success was Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where he collaborated with Steven Spielberg and solidified his position as an actor with depth and special appeal. In a very short time, he was not only a star, but became an icon of 1970s American cinema, receiving many prestigious nominations and awards such as the Golden Globe and BAFTA, along with widespread recognition from critics and audiences alike. His name appeared on rankings, on magazine covers, and in every discussion about the greatest actors of the era, a journey that for many people takes a lifetime, but for him unfolded almost entirely in just a few short years. But that very speed was also something he was never prepared to face. Because behind the titles and the spotlight was a man who had never truly learned how to hold on to himself. Long sleepless nights began to appear. Feelings of emptiness crept in, even when he was in the middle of thunderous applause, and to cope with those things he could not name, he turned to cocaine, at first as a way to control his emotions, but gradually it became the thing that controlled him, pulling him into spirals of chaos that no one could see from the outside. His career began to falter. Relationships cracked, bad decisions piled up, until a serious accident forced him to stop and look straight at his life. But even when he began trying to change, that path was not easy at all, because what had happened could not be erased, only carried forward, and at the age of 78, he continues to live, not as someone who has triumphed over everything, but as someone who has fallen many times, gotten back up many times, and has never truly escaped the battle with himself. Before stepping further into that dark journey behind the glamour, please hit like and leave a heart as a way of acknowledging a person who once stood at the peak, but still had to fight so as not to lose himself. And if this story touches you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the next part, where we will see what really happened when the spotlight went out, and only a man was left facing his own life. Behind the spotlight and the rounds of applause that the world once gave to Richard Dreyfuss is a truth that few ever saw, that the feeling of insecurity in him did not begin in Hollywood, but had formed much earlier, from the years of childhood where on the outside everything seemed sufficient, but inside there was a lack of the most important thing: emotional stability. He was born into a family that was not poor, did not grow up in hunger or material shortage, but that did not mean he felt safe, because safety does not come from money, but from the feeling of being loved and accepted. And that was exactly what he always felt was missing. His father was a strict, rational man who rarely showed affection, a person who believed in discipline more than tenderness, and in the eyes of a child, that silence was not strength, but distance. Every time he did not receive praise, every time he was not recognized, a feeling grew in him that he was not good enough, that he needed to do more to deserve to be seen, to be loved, to exist fully. And that gradually became an invisible pressure he carried throughout his childhood, a pressure no one spoke of, but was always present in every thought of his, in every look he gave to the world around him. His mother, a strong and independent woman, brought a different kind of distance, not strictness but a subtle detachment. She was not cold, but she was not close in the way a child needed. She had her own life, her own work, her own concerns, and amid all of that, he seemed to have to find his own way to exist, to learn how to understand his own emotions without anyone guiding him, without anyone really sitting down and telling him that everything would be okay, that he was good enough just as he was. And it was the absence of those small moments that created a very large void, a void that he would later try to fill with fame, with success, with roles that made the whole world look his way. But at that time, when he was still a child, he only knew that something was not right, that something always made him feel uneasy, as if at any moment he could be judged, rejected, or left behind. That feeling did not come from a specific event, but from hundreds, thousands of small moments accumulated. The times he tried to do better but still did not feel it was enough. The times he looked at others and wondered why they seemed more confident, more at peace. While he always carried a nameless worry, a worry that if he stopped, if he no longer tried, then no one would see him anymore. No one would need him anymore. And that very fear became the strongest driving force in his life, pushing him forward, but at the same time pulling him down, making him never truly able to rest, never truly feel that he was enough. And then, from very early on, he began to believe that his value did not lie in who he was as a person, but in what he could do, in who he could become in the eyes of others. A dangerous belief, but an extremely common one in children who grew up lacking emotional stability, because when not loved unconditionally, people learn to seek love through achievements, through recognition, through becoming the version that others want. And for Richard Dreyfuss, that was not just a phase but became the foundation for his entire later life, a foundation that both helped him reach the peak and quietly pushed him to the brink of collapse. Looking back, perhaps no one can point out the exact moment when everything began. There was no major incident, no clear event. Only a child growing up with the feeling that he had to prove himself continuously, that he was never allowed to be weak, that if he was not good enough, he would be left behind. And that very child, carrying all those fears and desires, stepped into the world of the spotlight, bringing with him a heart that had never truly felt safe, a heart that was always searching for something it had never had and did not know if it would ever truly find. From that silent void of childhood, Richard Dreyfuss gradually found a place where, for the first time in his life, he felt he was not being judged, not lacking, not questioned whether he was enough or not. And that place was not family, not school, but the stage, the roles, the moments he stepped into a world where he no longer had to be himself. Because when the lights came on and the lines began, he was no longer the child carrying insecurity. He became someone else, a person with a clear purpose, with words already written, with emotions already shaped, and most importantly, with acceptance, not reluctant acceptance but direct, clear recognition from the eyes watching him, from the rounds of applause that rang out when the performance ended. For the first time, he did not need to guess what others thought of him, because he could see it, hear it, feel it clearly. And that very clarity became something he had never had in real life, a feeling of control that he could not find anywhere else. On stage, everything had order, had logic, had cause and effect. Unlike real life, where emotions came in a chaotic and unpredictable way, where a single glance could make him doubt himself, where a moment of silence could become proof that he was not needed. But when acting, he knew exactly where he was, what he was doing, who he was becoming, and that gave him a brief but strong enough peace to make him return again and again. Not because he wanted to become a famous actor, but because it was the only place where he felt he existed fully, where he did not have to try to be liked, but only needed to perform his role well. But that very refuge gradually became a dependency he did not realize, because the more he felt recognized on stage, the greater the gap grew between his real self and what he was showing. Each time the lights went out, each time he left the role, the feeling of emptiness returned, even stronger than before, as if he had just lost a part of himself, as if his real self was not enough to exist without the gaze of others. And gradually, he was not only acting to show talent, but acting to feel he had value, acting to fill the void, acting to prove that he deserved to be here. The first steps in the industry were not easy at all. There was no immediate success, no big roles appearing from the beginning. He had to accept small roles, scarce opportunities, auditions where he was not chosen, moments standing outside watching others step into the world he longed for. And each time like that, the old fear returned, that perhaps he was not good enough, that perhaps everything he felt on stage was only temporary, that maybe one day he would become the person no one saw, no one needed. But instead of stopping, he continued, not because of confidence, but because he had no other choice, because if he left acting, he would have to face himself completely, with questions that never had answers, with a feeling of not being enough that he had carried since childhood, and so he clung to the stage as the only place that kept him from falling, as the only place that helped him believe he could become someone, something meaningful, even if only for a few short hours under the lights. And then, that very desire to be seen, that very fear of being forgotten, became the silent driving force pushing him forward, step by step, through small roles, through scarce opportunities, through disappointments he could not show, until one day the world began to look his way. But when that happened, when the lights were no longer temporary but became part of his life, he still did not know how high the price would be for being seen, and that the place that once saved him would also be the place that began to make him lose himself. Then one day, what Richard Dreyfuss both craved and feared finally happened, not in slow steps, but in a rushing wave that swept him away faster than he could understand. When the big roles began to come in the 1970s, when his name no longer appeared on the edge of the industry, but stepped straight into its center, from American Graffiti to Jaws, then continuing with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he was not just an actor working. He became the face of a new era of cinema, where Hollywood was changing and he stood right in the middle of that change. Working with Steven Spielberg not only brought opportunities, but also lifted him to a position he had never imagined before, where every eye was on him, where every word, every gesture was noticed, where a role was not just a job but became part of a legacy, and in just a short period of time, everything he had ever searched for seemed within reach. But what no one realized, and perhaps he himself did not realize at the time, was that the speed of that change was too great for a person who had never truly felt safe with himself. Because while the outside world was lifting him up, inside him there was nothing solid enough to keep him standing there. The stage lights illuminated everything others could see: fame, talent, success, but they could not touch the darkness he had carried for so long, could not touch the insecurity, could not touch the feeling that all of this could disappear at any moment. And that very gap between the two worlds began to create a pressure he did not know how to name, nor how to control. He became a Hollywood icon before he had the psychological foundation to become an icon, while he was still a person trying to understand himself, while he was still searching for the feeling of being enough that he had never had. And instead of bringing peace, fame made everything bigger, clearer, more intense. Each praise did not make him feel enough, but only made him fear losing it. Each gaze did not bring reassurance, but made him worry that one day that gaze would disappear, and he would return to the feeling that no one saw him, no one needed him. The pressure did not come from a single source, but from every direction, from the industry demanding he continue to succeed, from audiences expecting him to repeat what he had done, from himself as he began to believe his value was tied to whether he could maintain that position or not. And in all of that, there was no room for weakness, no room to stop, no room to admit that he was not okay, that he did not know what he was doing, that he was afraid because, when the whole world looked at him as a model of success, he no longer allowed himself to be an ordinary person anymore. And it was precisely in the years when everything seemed most perfect that the cracks began to spread, not as big noticeable events, but as small changes, unstable emotions, reactions he could not control, moments when he felt he was drifting away without being able to hold on, as if he was living a life he did not fully own, as if everything was happening to him rather than chosen by him. And the scariest thing was not that change itself, but the fact that he did not know how to stop it. Fame, which he once thought would save him, gradually became what imprisoned him, because the more he was seen, the more he felt he had to become a certain version he was not sure he could maintain. And with each passing day, the gap between his real self and the image the world saw grew larger, to the point where he no longer knew what was real, what was a role, what was the person he was living as. And in that vagueness, in that loss of control, something began to form, slowly but surely, like a natural response of a person trying to cope with what was beyond his ability to endure. No one told him how to stand firm when everything came too fast. No one taught him how to hold himself when the whole world was pulling him along, expectations he had never prepared for. And so he began to look for another way to feel in control, another way to soothe what was chaotic inside, a way that at first seemed harmless, but later would become the starting point of a chain of decisions he could not go back from. Because when a person cannot control the outside world, they will find a way to control the feelings inside themselves. And sometimes that very thing pushes them further away from the person they once wanted to become. And then, while the world believed that Richard Dreyfuss had achieved everything a person could dream of, inside him, a different truth was gradually becoming clear. That success did not bring the peace he had once hoped for. It did not soothe the insecurities that had existed for so long. It did not fill the void he had carried from childhood. It did not answer the questions he had never been able to name. On the contrary, it made everything clearer and more intense, when each new success no longer brought the feeling of being enough, but only brought a new fear. The fear that he would not be able to repeat it, that everything he had was only temporary, that one day everything would disappear and leave him right where he had always feared most, where no one saw him, no one needed him. The pressure no longer came from the outside, but began to come from inside him. When he placed upon himself a standard that no one could maintain forever, he had to keep succeeding. He had to keep being liked. He had to keep proving that he deserved everything he had achieved. And in that process, he gradually lost the ability to rest, lost the ability to feel simple joy, because every moment not working, not being recognized, became a reminder that he could lose everything. And so he did not allow himself to stop. Even when his body was tired, even when his mind began to crack, sleepless nights began to become familiar. Not because he did not have time to sleep, but because he could not turn off the thoughts in his head, thoughts that repeated over and over about what had happened, about what could happen, about whether he really deserved the position he was standing in or not. And in the silence of the night, when there were no more rounds of applause, no more lights, no more anything to shield him, the feeling of emptiness became clearer than ever. Like an endless void he did not know how to fill, a void that the more he tried to avoid it, the larger it became. And the scariest thing was not that emptiness itself, but the fact that he began to doubt himself even when he was at the peak, doubting that everything he had achieved might be just a misunderstanding, that he was not really as good as others thought, that one day that truth would be exposed and everything would collapse. And that very doubt made him unable to enjoy any success, because every success came with a question, whether he could keep it or not. Fame, which he once believed was the answer, gradually became a magnifying glass, making every emotion bigger, every pain deeper, every fear clearer, when each mistake was no longer a small mistake but became a big problem. Each unstable emotion was no longer a passing moment but became a sign of something more serious. And in a world where everything was seen, evaluated, and discussed, he no longer had space to be weak, no longer had a place to hide, no longer had any way to be an ordinary person. And it was precisely in that prolonged tension, when he no longer had the ability to adjust himself, when he no longer knew how to soothe what was happening inside, that he began to look for another way, a temporary escape, something that could help him turn off the thoughts, soothe the feeling of emptiness, give him a sense of control that he had lost long ago, and at first it seemed like a solution, a way to continue, a way to endure. But he did not realize that each time he relied on it, he stepped further away from himself, that what he was turning to was not the answer, but another path leading him to the loss of control he had tried to avoid from the beginning. In the eyes of the world, he was still a star, still an icon of success, still the man everyone wanted to become. But in the moments no one saw, when he was alone with himself, the truth was completely different. There was no glamour, no certainty, only a man trying to keep himself from falling, trying to understand what was happening to him, trying to believe that he still had control over his life, even though deep inside he began to sense that he was gradually losing that, little by little, slowly, but irreversibly. And then, at a moment he himself could not clearly define, Richard Dreyfuss stepped over a boundary that at first seemed very small, almost unnoticeable, a choice that appeared as a temporary solution for what he could not control inside himself. When cocaine entered his life not as rebellion, but as a way to soothe the chaotic emotions, to temporarily turn off the non-stop thoughts, to give him a feeling he had lost long ago, the feeling that he was controlling something, even if only for a short time. And in the first times, it seemed to work exactly as he needed. It made the world slow down, made the worries lighter, made the emptiness seem not as scary as before. But what he did not realize, or perhaps did not want to realize, was that each time he relied on it, he was handing over a part of his control, that what he was using to control his emotions gradually became what controlled him. And that change did not happen overnight. There was no clear moment for him to look back and say, this was when everything turned bad, but it happened slowly, little by little, through uses that became more frequent, through nights when he no longer found any other way to cope with himself, through moments when he began to believe that he needed it to continue, to work, to appear, to exist in the world he had built. The long nights began to stretch longer, no longer just sleeplessness, but becoming periods when he drifted in a state between alertness and loss of control, where time no longer had meaning, where emotions were no longer clear, where he could feel he was at the peak, only to fall right after into a darkness he could not explain. And in those moments, he was no longer the person the world saw, no longer the celebrated actor, but a man trying to keep himself from breaking, trying to find again the feeling he had lost long ago. But the more he tried, the further he went from it. Decisions began to change, not immediately in a way others could notice, but as small choices, actions that seemed unimportant but gradually accumulated, forming a chain of consequences he could not control. Conversations became more tense, relationships began to crack, opportunities slipped away for reasons he could not explain. And each time, like that, instead of stopping and looking at the cause, he turned again to the thing that had once helped him feel better, as a way to forget what had just happened, to keep moving forward without facing the consequences. The boundary between his real self and the image the world saw began to blur, not because he deliberately hid it, but because he was no longer sure what was real and what was a role. When what he showed to the public no longer fully reflected what he felt inside, when smiles were no longer expressions of joy but became part of the role he had to maintain, when confidence was no longer a natural emotion but something he had to create to meet expectations, and in that process he gradually lost the ability to recognize himself, as if he was living in a story where he was no longer the writer. There were rare moments when he realized something was wrong, when he looked at himself and saw a distance he could not explain, when he sensed he was slipping away from the person he once wanted to become. But those moments did not last long enough to create change, because right after that the familiar emotions returned, stronger, demanding more, and he turned again to the only thing he believed could help him get through, even though deep inside he began to understand that each time like that he went further from the point where he could return. In the eyes of others, perhaps everything had not completely collapsed yet. There were still signs of success. There were still roles. There were still opportunities. But inside, the foundation had begun to crack, not because of one big event, but because of hundreds of small choices, moments when he chose the easier way instead of facing things, times when he believed he still had control of the situation, while in reality the situation had begun to control him. And the scariest thing was not that he had crossed that boundary, but that he did not know how to come back, did not know how to stop, did not know whether he still had enough ability to become himself again or not. And then there came a point where Richard Dreyfuss could no longer convince himself that everything was still okay. The changes inside him began to appear more clearly to those around him as well, no longer just private moments in the dark, but becoming part of the way he existed every day. His personality gradually changed in a way that even he could not control. His reactions became more extreme. His outbursts of anger came faster and more intense. Simple conversations could turn into conflicts, and the people who had once been close to him began to sense a distance they did not know how to bridge, because the person they had once known seemed to be disappearing, replaced by a different version, unpredictable, easily hurt, and at the same time easily hurtful to others. In his work, the things that had once been his strengths began to become problems. The sensitivity that had once helped him act with depth now made him difficult to work with. Small requests could become major pressure. Changes in the script could make him react strongly. And in an industry where everything depended on cooperation and trust, those changes could not help but have consequences. Colleagues began to be cautious. Producers began to hesitate, not because he no longer had talent, but because they were no longer sure whether he could maintain the necessary stability or not. And while he still appeared in front of the camera, still completed his roles, behind that the trust was gradually eroded, little by little, quietly but irreversibly. The irony was that in the eyes of the public, his image remained almost unchanged. He was still the star they had once known, still the man with talent that made them believe in every role, still the icon of an era they loved. But that image no longer reflected his real self anymore. It became a shell he had to carry, a role he had to maintain even when he was no longer on stage. And that very difference between the two selves began to exhaust him, because to keep that image, he had to constantly hide what was happening inside, had to keep appearing as if everything was still okay, had to keep playing the part of someone he was no longer sure he could become. The feeling of emptiness was no longer just fleeting moments, but became a prolonged state, a part of life he could not escape from. It appeared even when he was working, even when he was being applauded, like a void that nothing could fill, not by success, not by recognition, not by anything he had once believed would help him feel enough. And that made everything harder, because when nothing brought a sense of completeness, everything became meaningless. And when everything became meaningless, continuing became a burden he did not know how to let go of. There were times when he realized he was losing control, that what was happening was not normal, that the path he was on was not leading to where he wanted to go. But realizing was not the same as being able to change, because to change, he had to face everything he had tried to avoid, had to look at himself without any shield, had to accept that what he had done, what he had become, was not the result of circumstances, but the result of the choices he had made. And that was a truth he was not yet ready to face. And so, even though there were moments of clarity, even though there were times he promised himself he would stop, would change, would find another way, he still continued, not because he wanted to, but because he did not know how not to continue, because when a habit becomes part of the way you exist, giving it up is not just changing behavior, but changing who you are. And for him, that seemed too big, too difficult, too distant to carry out. Especially when he still had to maintain an image in front of the world, still had to continue working, still had to appear as if everything was still under control. But deep inside, He began to understand that he no longer had control anymore, that what he had once believed was a tool had now become a burden, that the path he was on was no longer a choice but momentum, a current he was being swept along without being able to stop. And the scariest thing was not that loss of control itself, but the feeling that it could continue forever, that he could go so far that there was no way back, that one day he would look back and no longer recognize the person he had once been. And then, on a night when nothing gave any warning, everything nearly ended for Richard Dreyfuss, in a way he himself could not have imagined. A car accident happened in 1982, not as an isolated event, not as a random moment, but as the convergence point of everything that had accumulated over many years, of the sleepless nights, of the wrong choices, of the loss of control he had tried to ignore. And when the car sped through the darkness, when everything happened so fast, there was no time to think. He was not only facing the risk of losing his life, but facing a truth he had avoided for too long, that his life was no longer in his hands anymore. That moment did not last long, but it was enough for everything to become clear in a way it had never been clear before, when he realized that everything he had built, everything he had achieved, could disappear in just 1 second, not because of a great tragedy from the outside, but because of what was happening inside him, and in the fragility of that moment, between the very thin line between living and no longer existing. He did not think about fame, did not think about the films, did not think about the rounds of applause, but only faced himself, the person he had become, the path he had taken, and the question he could not answer, how he had reached this point. It was not a single accident, not an incident that could be separated from the rest of his life and seen as a regrettable mishap, but the result of a long process, of repeated decisions, of choosing avoidance instead of facing things, of seeking control in things that in the end took away that control. And when he looked back, even if only in a brief moment, he began to see the connection between all of that, saw that nothing in his life had happened randomly, that every step he took, no matter how small, had led him here, to a point where he was no longer sure whether he could come back or not. The feeling of nearly disappearing from his own life was not a metaphor, but a real experience, when he realized that the person the world saw and the person he felt inside had become so far apart that he no longer knew what was real, what was fake, what was the person he had once been, and what was the version he had become. And in that moment, when everything seemed like it could end, what frightened him most was not death, but how he had lived up to that point, that if everything stopped right then, that would be the story he left behind. A story not about talent, not about success, but about a person who had lost himself without knowing how to find himself again. When everything settled down, when he was still here, still breathing, still had the chance to continue, the truth did not become lighter. It became heavier, because now he could no longer pretend that he did not know, could no longer continue to believe that everything was still under control, because he had seen what could happen, had felt the very small distance between continuing to live and disappearing completely, and that forced him to face a choice he had avoided for too long, whether he would continue as before, or he would try to change, even though he did not know if he could or not. But change was not a decision that could be made in a single moment, especially when what needed to be changed had become part of who he was, when the habits, the coping mechanisms, the choices had sunk deep into the way he existed. And so even when he realized the seriousness of the situation, even when he understood that he could lose everything, the road ahead did not become clear, did not become easy, but remained blurry, still full of questions without answers, still demanding that he face things he had never learned how to face. And then, that night was not the end. But it was also not a new beginning in the way people usually think. It did not bring immediate change. It did not erase what had happened. It did not turn him into a different person just after one event, but it only did one single thing. It forced him to look straight at the reality he had tried to avoid. It forced him to understand that if he continued as before, the result might not be any different, and that if he wanted any chance to keep his life, he would have to do the hardest thing, not fighting the world, but fighting himself, with everything he had become, with everything he had relied on to exist. And in the silence after it all, when there was no more noise, no more chaos, only him with himself, a realization began to form, slowly but unavoidably, that he had gone too far to go back as before, that the road ahead would never be simple, and that from this moment on, his life would no longer be about preserving what he had, but about trying not to lose what was left, little by little, in a battle that no one could fight for him. After that night, when everything could no longer be ignored, Richard Dreyfuss was forced to step into a journey he had never truly prepared for. Not a journey to regain fame, not a journey to return to the peak, but a journey to try to hold on to himself, piece by piece, amid what had been broken. And that journey did not begin with a powerful moment or a decisive decision, but began with a very difficult admission that he no longer had control over his life anymore, that what he had once relied on had now become what was pulling him down, and that if he did not change, everything would end in the way he had seen that night. But beginning did not mean everything became easy, because quitting addiction was not just giving up a substance, but giving up a way of existing, a way of coping with the world that he had been familiar with for many years. And when he tried to separate himself from it, what remained was not peace, but all the emotions he had tried to avoid, returning all at once, stronger, clearer, no longer blurred, no longer pushed down, and in those moments he had to face himself in a way he had never done, with no lights, no roles, no shield of any kind to hide behind, only him and what he felt, what he thought, what he feared. The first days did not bring a feeling of liberation, but brought a feeling of loss, as if he was losing a part of himself, even though that part had caused so much damage, because when something becomes part of the way you exist, giving it up is not just changing behavior, but changing who you are. And in that process he had to relearn things that others might have learned long ago. How to face emotions without avoiding them. How to endure difficult moments without looking for a quick escape. How to exist in uncertainty without trying to control everything. But that journey did not follow a straight line. There was no clear progress where each step led to improvement, but a series of steps forward and backward. Days when he felt he was getting closer to a more stable version of himself, and days when he felt everything was collapsing again. Relapses were not the end, but they were also not something that could be overlooked. Each time, like that, carried a feeling of failure, a feeling that perhaps he was not strong enough to change, that perhaps the person he had become was beyond repair. And those very thoughts made the journey longer and harder, because he not only had to fight the habit, but also had to fight the way he saw himself. There was no immediate change, no moment when everything became clear and easy, only small steps, sometimes very small, to the point where no one else could see them. Days when he chose not to return to the old path, moments when he stopped instead of continuing, times when he faced emotions instead of avoiding them. And although those steps were not enough to create a big change right away, they were the only things that kept him from falling back completely, the only things that helped him move forward, even if just a little, in a journey whose length he did not know. Many years passed, and that battle never truly ended. There was no point where he could say he had overcome everything, that he had completely escaped what had once controlled him, because what he had been through did not disappear. It only changed the way it existed, becoming less loud, less obvious, but still present, in moments of weakness, in difficult days, in thoughts he still had to learn to recognize and not let them lead him. And perhaps the hardest thing was not letting go of the past, but accepting that that past would always be a part of him, that he could not go back to the person he had once been before everything happened. that he could not erase what he had done, what he had lost, what had changed, but could only learn to live with it, learn to continue without needing to be perfect, learn to exist without needing to control everything, and in that acceptance, even though it did not bring complete relief, he began to find something else, not victory, but the ability to continue, the ability to stand firm even while still carrying everything that had happened. His journey back was not a story of complete redemption, not a path leading to a clear ending, but a prolonged process with no end point, where each day was a choice, each step was an effort, and each moment of existence was proof that even though he had gone very far from where he started, even though he had lost control many times, he had not disappeared, had not given up, was still continuing day by day in a battle no one saw. But for him, it was everything. And then, when Richard Dreyfuss gradually regained some control in his life, he returned to the only thing he had once known how to do, acting. But this time, everything was no longer the same as before. There were no longer roles handed to him naturally. There was no longer the central position he had once held. There was no longer the feeling that the entire industry was waiting for him to step in, because Hollywood was not a place that stopped to wait for anyone, even those who had once stood at the peak. And during the time he struggled with himself, that world had continued moving forward, with new faces, new stories, new names replacing what had once seemed irreplaceable. His return was not a big moment, not an event that made everyone turn their heads to look back, but a slow, quiet process, where he accepted roles that before he probably would never have considered, not because they had no value, but because they no longer brought the status he had once had. And in those roles, he was no longer the lead, no longer the center of every gaze, but became a part of the story, a piece in a larger picture, and that required him to change the way he saw himself, his work, the value of what he did. It was not easy to accept that the golden period had passed, not easy to look at the past and understand that those moments would not return, not because he no longer had talent, but because time had moved on, because what had happened could not be reversed, and because the world never stood still. And in that acceptance there was a sadness he could not deny, a feeling of loss, not only about the position, but about a part of the person he had once been, a part he had been attached to, had built, had believed would last longer. But along with that sadness, there was also another change, slow but clear, when he began to see his work in a different way, no longer as a means to prove himself, no longer as a way to fill the void, but as something he could still do, could still contribute, could still find meaning in, even if no longer from the position he had once stood in. And in those new roles, though smaller and less noticed, he brought something he had never had before, an understanding of himself, of what he had been through, of what he had lost, and what he still kept. His career was no longer the place where he sought absolute recognition, but became a part of the life he maintained, a way to continue connecting with the world, with audiences, with himself, not to affirm that he was still someone, but to remind himself that he was still here, still able to do what he loved, even if in a different way, in a different space, with a different role. And in that change, there was a humility he had never had before, an acceptance that his value did not lie only in what he had achieved, but also in the way he continued when things were no longer as before. Those who had once worked with him began to see a different person, no longer the one who easily lost control, no longer the one swept up by what he could not manage, but a person who clearly understood his own limits, clearly understood what he could do and what he needed to avoid. And although that did not bring him back to the peak, it helped him stand firm where he was, a place that might not be as brilliant as before, but more stable, more realistic, and, perhaps, truer to the person he had become. His career did not end, but it changed, no longer a straight upward line, but became a journey with stops, slow steps, turns he could not predict. And in that journey, he no longer tried to become the person from the past, but learned to exist in the present, with everything he carried, with everything he had been through, and with the understanding that there were things that could not be taken back, but there were still things worth preserving. And perhaps, in that change, in letting go of the need to always stand at the highest position, he began to find a different kind of peace, not complete satisfaction, not the feeling of having achieved everything, but the acceptance that life does not always go the way one wishes, and that sometimes continuing, still standing firm, still doing what one can, was already a form of success he had never thought of before. And then, while Richard Dreyfuss tried to find balance in his work, another truth gradually emerged in his private life. That not everything could be fixed by personal effort alone, that there were wounds that had spread beyond him, touching the closest people, the people who had been by his side not because of the spotlight, but because of who he was. And it was right there, where he should have been able to find peace, that everything became the most fragile, when his first marriage gradually fell apart, not because of a lack of affection, but because he could not truly be present in the way a life partner needed. Because even when he was there physically, his mind was somewhere else, pulled by what he had not yet resolved, by the battles he was still trying to hide. His partner was not understanding, was not untrying, but there were things that understanding could not replace. There were voids that love could not fill on its own. And when a person constantly had to face an unstable, inconsistent, unpredictable version of the one they loved, the exhaustion began to accumulate, not in one day, but through small moments, incomplete conversations, times of waiting without response, times of hoping things would be different, only to realize it remained the same. And eventually that exhaustion turned into distance, a distance that even if both wanted to, they did not know how to narrow. It did not stop there. His personal problems also spread to the family, to the people he had the responsibility to protect, to the children he should have been a support for, but in many moments he could not become the person they needed. Not because he did not love them, but because he did not know how to show it when he himself was lost. And that left marks that time did not easily erase. Memories of a father who was not always present, not always stable, not always able to provide the sense of safety a child needs to grow up. The role of being a father, for him, was not something simple, not a natural part of life he could take on without thinking, but a responsibility that came with many questions, many doubts, many regrets when he looked back and realized there were moments he had missed, moments that could not be returned, things he could have done differently if he had understood himself better, if he had not been swept up in what happened. And those very realizations did not bring relief, but brought a heavy feeling, a feeling that there were things that could not be completely fixed, that there were wounds that no matter how hard he tried would still leave traces. Gradually, he began to understand that what he had been through did not only affect him alone, but affected all the people close to him. That every time he lost control, every time he withdrew, every time he could not be present, there was a consequence he could not see at that moment, but would appear over time. And that forced him to face a hard-to-accept truth, that he was not only a victim of what happened to him, but also the one who caused harm to others, not intentionally but still real. Love, which many people believe can heal everything, in his case, was not enough to change the core. Because love could not replace the willingness to change, could not do the work that a person must do with himself, could not force an inner transformation if that person had not truly faced what needed to be changed, and for him, there were periods when he was not ready, not strong enough, not clear enough to do that. And so even with love around him, even with people by his side, he still went through losses that, perhaps, if at a different time, with a different person, everything could have been different. But the most painful thing was not that love could not save him, but that he realized it when it was too late to keep everything, when what had been lost could not come back, when relationships had changed in a way that could not be reversed. And in that realization, he not only saw what he had been through, but also saw what he had caused, what he had not done, what he had missed, and that very awareness became a part of the journey he had to continue, not to erase the past, but to live with it, to understand it, to not repeat it, even knowing that there were things, once they happened, would always stay, like a reminder he could never forget. And then, after everything that had happened, after the years when Richard Dreyfuss tried to understand why his life had gone in a direction he could not control, a truth gradually revealed itself, not as a simple explanation, but as the final piece that helped him look back at his entire journey in a different way, when he publicly revealed that he had bipolar disorder, a condition that for many years before he had not fully understood, did not know how to name, only knew that something inside him always changed dramatically, unpredictably, and uncontrollably, and that very lack of understanding had made him blame himself, believe that what he went through was only weakness, personal mistakes, bad choices he should have been able to avoid if he had been stronger. But when looking back with new understanding of himself, he began to see a different picture, where the manic and depressive episodes were no longer random moments, but part of a cycle he had lived with for many years without realizing. Times when he felt he could do anything, when energy surged, when confidence seemed almost limitless, when everything seemed within reach. And right after that were periods completely the opposite, when everything became heavy, when even simple actions became difficult, when the feeling of emptiness was not just a void but a weight pulling him down, making him unable to escape. And that constant shift between the two states had deeply affected every aspect of his life, from work, relationships, to the way he saw himself. Understanding that did not erase what had happened, did not make the mistakes disappear, did not heal the wounds immediately. But it changed the way he looked back at the past, no longer just a series of wrong decisions, but a journey he had gone through without enough information, without enough tools to understand himself. And in that change there was a very small relief, not because he was freed from responsibility, but because he no longer had to carry that entire burden alone, no longer had to believe that everything happened just because he was not good enough, not strong enough, not worthy enough. But along with that understanding also came another truth, harder to accept, that this was not a problem that could be solved once and for all, that there was no point where he could say he had completely overcome it, that this battle had no clear ending, no day when he would wake up and everything would disappear, but it would always be there in some way, in moments of weakness, in difficult days, in thoughts he had to learn to recognize and not let them lead him. And that very continuity made the journey different from what he had experienced before. No longer about trying to escape something specific, but about learning how to live with it. Learning to live with it was not an easy decision, not an immediate acceptance without resistance, but a long process where he had to change the way he saw himself, no longer as a person who needed to be perfect, needed to control everything, needed to always be strong, but as a human being with limits, with parts he needed to pay attention to, needed to take care of, needed to understand instead of trying to overcome them by sheer willpower alone. And in that process, he began to build a different relationship with himself, a relationship not based on judgment but on awareness, not based on trying to become someone else but on understanding and accepting the person he was. There were days when he still felt everything became difficult, days when unstable emotions returned, days when he had to remind himself of everything he had learned, everything he had been through, so as not to fall back into the old cycles. And on those days he no longer tried to avoid, no longer looked for a quick escape, but stayed with himself, even though it was not comfortable, even though it demanded more, because he understood that only that way could help him not lose what he had tried to rebuild. The battle inside his mind was not a war that could be won, not a goal that could be achieved, but a state he had to learn to manage, learn to live with, learn to continue without letting it completely define who he was. And in that change, even though it did not bring a complete ending, it gave him something he had never had before, a deep understanding of himself, of what he had been through, of what he could do and what he needed to accept, and in that understanding there was a different kind of peace. Not absolute stillness, but the ability to continue, even though the battle remained, even though things had never truly been easy. And then, after going through enough events to understand that there were things in life that could not be returned to or fixed the way he had once hoped, Richard Dreyfuss began to look for a different direction. Not to restore what had been lost, but to create something meaningful from what remained. And in that process he founded the Dreyfuss Civics Initiative, an organization not tied to the spotlight or film fame, but tied to civic education, to helping people better understand their role in society, their responsibilities, their rights, how an individual could contribute to a larger community, and for him, that was not just a project, but a way to redirect his life towards something that brought value in a different way. He spent his time speaking, teaching, participating in education programs, not as a star, but as a person who had been through enough to understand that there were things more important than fame, that there were values that could not be measured by the number of awards or celebrity, but by the way a person could positively influence others. And in those spaces there was no longer pressure to be perfect, no longer a need to prove anything, only sharing, contributing, being present in a way he had never experienced before. What he did was not an effort to erase the past, not a way to compensate for everything that had happened, because he understood that there were things that could not be balanced out, that the wounds he had caused could not disappear just because of good actions later, but a way to live with that past, to not let it become the only thing defining who he was, to create moments he could look back on and know he had done something meaningful, even if small, even if unnoticed, but real. In those efforts, he began to find a kind of peace he had never had before. Not the thrill of success, not recognition from millions of people, but the quiet when knowing that what he was doing was not only serving himself, not only to fill the void, but to create value for others. And in that quiet, he no longer needed to play any role, no longer needed to become a model, no longer needed to maintain an image, but only needed to be himself with everything he had been through, with everything he had learned. His actions might not be grand in the way Hollywood defined, with no rounds of applause, no lights, no titles attached, but they brought him a feeling he had always searched for without knowing how to achieve, the feeling of having value, not because of who he was in the eyes of others, but because of what he could do, what he could bring, what he could contribute, and that even if it came late, even if imperfect, was still an important part of his journey. He did not become a completely different person, did not escape what had once happened, did not turn his life into a story without scars, but simply added a new direction to it, a new way of living, where he no longer focused only on what he had lost, but began to pay attention to what he could still do. And in that change, even though it did not erase the pain, it made the pain more bearable, more understandable, able to be placed in a context where he was no longer completely dominated by it. And, perhaps, in everything he had been through, the most important thing was not how much he had achieved or how much he had lost, but that he had found a way to continue without needing to become the version the world once expected, a way to live without needing to run away from himself, a way to exist without needing to be perfect. And in those small steps, even though they did not change the whole story, they created moments he could look at and know he was still here, still able to do something meaningful, even if not big, but real. And perhaps for him that was enough to keep going. As the years gradually moved further back and the pace of life slowed down, Richard Dreyfuss entered another stage of his life, where there were no longer the violent waves as before. But it was also not complete stillness, because old age did not erase what had happened. It only made everything clearer. When there was no longer so much noise from work, from fame, from expectations, memories began to surface more clearly, not as distant images, but as parts still alive in him. The moments he had experienced, the decisions he had made, the people he had met, and all of that existed side by side in a space he could not leave. He appeared in public less often, no longer the center of attention, no longer had to maintain a constant image. And in that change, there was a certain lightness, but also a void he had never felt this way before. Because when the lights gradually went out, what remained was not recognition but himself, with everything he carried, and with nothing left to shield or distract. The silences became longer, deeper. And in those silences he could no longer run away, could no longer find a role to hide in, but had to stay with himself, with his thoughts, with his emotions, with the things he had once tried to avoid. Living with the past was not a choice he actively sought, but something he gradually learned to accept. Because the more he tried to forget, the more he tried to push it away, the more it returned in ways he could not control. And so instead of continuing to fight against it, he began to change his approach, no longer trying to erase it, no longer pretending it had never happened, but letting it exist as a part of him, not to let it define his entire self, but also not denying that it had helped shape who he was today. The memories were not always pleasant. There were moments he recalled with regret, decisions he wished he could have made differently, relationships he wished he could have preserved better, times when he had not been the person he wanted to become. And those thoughts did not disappear with time. They only changed the way they appeared. No longer as loud as before, but deeper, more lasting, like layers of sediment he had to carry, not felt clearly every day, but always there, ready to surface when he stopped long enough to look inward. But along with those memories, there was also a change in the way he saw himself, no longer constant judgment, no longer trying to become a perfect version he could not achieve, but a gradual, slow acceptance that he was not only his mistakes, not only the moments of lost control, but the sum of everything he had been through, both good and bad, both success and failure. And in that acceptance, even though it did not bring complete relief, it created a space where he could exist without constantly fighting himself. The passing days were no longer marked by big events, no longer by peaks or sharp falls, but by small moments, simple habits, conversations, times he spent with himself, and in that simplicity there was a kind of stability he had never had before. Not absolute control, but an understanding of his own limits, of what he needed to keep himself balanced, of the things he could not change, and the things he could still continue. But he did not become a completely different person, did not escape what had once shaped him, but only became a more conscious version, one who understood more, accepted more, and in that change, even though it did not erase the pain, it made the pain something he could live with, no longer something he had to avoid at all costs, but a part of the story he carried, a story that was not perfect, not complete, but real. And perhaps, in the silence after all the storms, the most important thing was not that everything had become better, but that he was still here, still able to look back, still able to understand, still able to accept, and in that continuation, even without the glory of before, without the rounds of applause, without the lights, there was still a value he no longer needed to prove to anyone else. A value that lay in the very act of his existing with everything that had happened, and with the ability to keep living with it, day by day, in the stillness he had once feared, but now had learned not to run from anymore. And after everything that had passed, when the storms had settled and only a long stillness remained, Richard Dreyfuss did not stand at a clear ending point, did not step into a new, complete chapter like the stories people usually expect, because his life had never been a straight line leading to perfection, but a bumpy journey where success and mistakes always existed side by side, where light and darkness were never completely separated, and if looking from afar, People might see a man who had achieved what many could not, but if looking closer, deeper, they would see a man who had fallen many times, lost himself many times, and had to learn how to stand up again many times without any guarantee that this time would be different. There was no moment when he completely escaped the past, no day when everything that had happened disappeared, no clear boundary between the person he once was and the person he was now. Because the past did not stand still behind him, it traveled with him in his thoughts, in his memories, in the reactions he still had to learn to recognize and adjust, and that was not a burden he could set down, but a part of who he was, a part he could not separate from, whether he wanted to or not. But it was precisely in that inability to escape where something else gradually formed, not liberation, not complete healing, but the ability to continue. The ability to live with what had happened without letting it completely control him. The ability to look at the past without being pulled back into it. The ability to accept that life did not need to be perfect to still have meaning, and in that acceptance, even though it did not bring absolute relief, it created a space where he could exist without constantly running away. He no longer searched for a final victory, no longer waited for a moment when everything would become clear and easy, no longer believed there would be a day when all he had been through would be replaced by something better. Because he had understood that life did not work that way, that there were things that could not be fixed, losses that could not be compensated, mistakes that could not be erased, and instead of continuing to search for a different ending, he chose to continue with his own story, with everything it included, even if imperfect, even if imperfect. Continuing was not a grand action, not a turning point decision, but a series of small choices, every day, every moment, when he chose not to return to the old path, when he chose to face things instead of avoiding them, when he chose acceptance instead of denial, and in those choices, even though they did not create a sudden change, they kept him moving forward, little by little, in a journey with no clear endpoint, but still with direction. He did not become a symbol of perfection, did not become a story of absolute triumph, but became proof of something else, that a person could make mistakes, could lose control, could lose himself, and still continue. Not by erasing the past, but by carrying it, understanding it, and not letting it define his entire self. And in that, there was a form of strength that was not always visible, a form of strength that did not come from never falling but from not stopping after having fallen. At the age of 78, he did not stand on a new peak, did not have a victory to declare, did not have a perfect ending to close his story, but only a man who was still living, still continuing, still carrying everything that had happened, not completely lighter, not completely easier, but also no longer the man who had once been swept away without being able to stop, but a man who understood himself better, understood his limits, understood what he could do and what he needed to accept. And perhaps, if there was one thing that could be said about his life, it was not that he had won, not that he had overcome everything, but that he had not disappeared, had not stopped, had not let what happened become the final period, but only a part of the story, a part he carried as he kept walking, even though the road ahead was never completely smooth, even though what was behind never completely disappeared. And in that continuation, there was a meaning that did not need to be recognized, did not need to be praised, only needed to be lived, day by day, in the truth of himself. The story of Richard Dreyfuss leaves a feeling that is both heartbreaking and full of respect, because it is not the journey of a person who achieved complete victory, but the journey of a man who once stood at the peak and then slipped down himself because of cracks inside that no one could see. From a young man who won an Oscar at the age of 30 with The Goodbye Girl, shining in Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he had everything the American dream promised: fame, money, recognition. But the story shows that success could not heal psychological wounds if they were not understood and faced. The sleepless nights, the dependence on cocaine, the accident in 1982 that nearly took his life, or the broken marriages were not isolated details, but a chain of consequences from a long internal battle that stretched from a childhood lacking emotional security. What makes the story worthy of respect does not lie in him having overcome everything, but in the fact that he still continues to live, continues to work, continues to contribute through the Dreyfuss Civics Initiative, even though he knows he will never completely escape the past. For American society, where success is often measured by external achievements, this story reminds us that mental health cannot be taken lightly, that seeking help is not weakness, and that the value of a person lies not only in the peaks they reach, but in the way they continue after they have fallen. Richard Dreyfuss is not a perfect role model, but that very imperfection reflects most truthfully about being human, and that is what makes him worthy of honor. If the story of Richard Dreyfuss makes you reflect, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way of cherishing a person who did not collapse even though he had once lost himself. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore imperfect but meaningful lives.